protect our men who are in Vietnam, and to guarantee the continued success of our withdrawal and Vietnamization programs, I have concluded that the time has come for action.
At the end of April and on the first day of May, American and South Vietnamese forces began crossing the frontiers of Cambodia.
Tear gas first started down the commons, then the guard moved up on both sides of Taylor Hall and forced the kids off the commons. Then one group, I don't know how many there were, 50 maybe, perhaps more, perhaps less, moved down to the practice football field.
After you feed them, then what will we do? Will you ask them to leave?
They've got grievances, they've got demands. There are demands on both sides. We have to talk.
And then there were a whole lot of kids around them. A few kids were throwing sticks and stones, but that was only a handful, not more than 10, 15. And then the guard shot some tear gas up on the hill to disperse the crowd, and the kids picked it up and threw it back.
We'll fly out. So I will make a perimeter, a circle, right out in here. From the right, you move out. You saw a big circle around here.
You don't talk during a state of emergency, Mike. You know that. Come on.
I'm sorry, but
we'll
I don't
talk
want
as
people
soon as
shot.
we get this
I
settled
don't
down.
want people shot on this campus, just as a citizen of this campus.
Who wants people
All
shot?
right, but they're sitting quietly.
Okay, will you ask them to leave?
This area immediately. Leave this area immediately.
And all of a sudden I heard the shooting. And then I saw people dropping to the ground, and then I fell to the ground also, because I couldn't walk anymore.
What the investigators have to determine then is whether indeed there was a sniper and whether the guard was justified in firing its weapons, or whether, as some people here believed, the guard, under the pressure of a rock-throwing attack, panicked and fired its weapons indiscriminately, killing 4 people.
A skirmish line equipped with tear gas, loaded weapons, only most of the students didn't know they were loaded with live ammunition, and fixed bayonets moved the students. Students later claimed we weren't doing anything. Freedom of speech and assembly was being denied. Later, the Scranton Commission and the FBI report agreed that the assembly was peaceful up to this point. The students disperse. Company C leaves, while the rest of the guard pursues students over Blanket Hill. Allison Krauss is visible to the troops for the first time. Barry Levine, whom she had arranged to meet at the rally and was holding her hand when she was shot, recalled that she was crying, not from the tear gas, but from the emotion of what was happening to her, her friends, and her campus. It was all there. The Cambodian announcement, a rally to bury a murdered constitution, destruction of business property in town, repressive restrictions, a burnt-out ROTC building, confusion among enforcement officials, and indiscriminate use of military power against the innocent and guilty. A prelude to murder.
What if I'm from Skaneateles? I'm going to Kent now. And it started out as a 12 o'clock rally, and I didn't know, what was going to happen afterwards. We were just meeting down in the Commons. The crowd followed them. They were yelling at them and throwing rocks. And I ran into Taylor Hall. I was standing in the corner. I pulled back the curtain, and I just saw them crouch down and start firing, and people driving in from there. It was just chaos. And I don't know. I didn't see the people that got shot because, you know, I was running and everyone was running and yelling and I can't.
Why do you think the guard opened fire?
Well, I don't know. I think they just lost control of the thing. I don't know. They were being hit with rocks.
Did you see any snipers?
No, I didn't see. The only thing I saw was when they turned around and crouched down and started shooting. And I don't know what started, you know, like all I can say is that they were being hit with rocks and it just looked like they lost control of, started firing. They didn't warn them or anything that they were going to fire. They just shot.
During the stay on the practice field, some of the guardsmen huddled together. These are members of Troop G, whose members were the first to fire. General Canterbury orders the men to march back up Blanket Hill. Troop G is on the right flank. Members of Troop G keep looking back toward the parking lot. Alan Canfori was later shot and wounded. Some rocks are still being thrown, but they are fewer now. These students are about 100 feet away from the guardsmen. Joseph Lewis is the closest person to the guard, except for those who are observing from Taylor Hall. The Scranton Commission later concluded the guards' march from Blanket Hill to the football field and back did not disperse the crowd and seems to have done little else than increase tension, subject guardsmen to needless abuse, and encourage the most violent and irresponsible elements in the crowd to harass the guard further. General Canterbury later testified, as the troop formation reached the area of the pagoda, the mob, located on the right flank in front of Taylor Hall and in the Prentice Hall parking lot, charged our right flank, throwing rocks, yelling obscenities and threats. Stick the pigs, kill the pigs. He continued, practically all the guardsmen were hit by missiles. Guardsmen on the right flank were in serious danger of bodily harm and death as the mob continued to charge. He concluded, in view of the extreme danger, they were justified in firing.
President, in the light of the Kent State University incident, could you tell us what, in your judgment, is the proper action and conduct for a police force or a National Guard force when ordered to clear a campus area and faced with a crowd throwing rocks?
We think we've done a rather good job here in Washington in that respect. As you note, we handled the two demonstrations, October 15th and November 15th of last year, without any significant casualties. And that took a lot of doing because there were some pretty rough people involved. A few were rough. Most of them were very peaceful. I would hope that the experience that we have had in that respect could be shared by the National Guards, which of course are not under federal control, but under state control. Now, what I say is not to be interpreted as a criticism in advance of my getting the facts of the National Guards at Kent State. I want to know what the facts are. I've asked for the facts, and when I get them, I'll have something to say about it. But I do know that when you do have a situation of a crowd throwing rocks, and the National Guard is called in, that there is always the chance that it will escalate into the kind of a tragedy that happened at Kent State. And if there's one thing I am personally committed to, it's this. I saw the pictures of those 4 youngsters in the Evening Star the day after that tragedy. And I vowed then that we were going to find methods that would be more effective to deal with these problems of violence, methods that would deal with those who would use force and violence and endanger others, but at the same time would not take the lives of innocent people.
But Nixon's disdain for protesters had been a reoccurring theme throughout his presidency. The issue came up in the Watergate hearings too.
I was made aware of the president's strong feelings about even the smallest of demonstrations during the late winter of 1971, when the president happened to look out the window of the residence of the White House and saw a lone man with a large 10-foot sign stretched out in front of Lafayette Park. Mr. Higbee called me to his office to tell me that the president's displeasure with the sign in the park, and told me that Mr. Haldeman had said that the sign had to come down. When I came out of Mr. Higbee's office, I ran into Dwight Chapin, who said he was going to get some thugs to remove the man from Lafayette Park. He said it would take him a few hours to get them, but they could do the job. I told him I didn't believe that was necessary.
In the conclusion of the Kent State part of the report, it states, the guard fired amidst great turmoil and confusion, engendered in part by their own activities. But the guardsmen should not have been able to kill so easily in the first place. The general issuance of loaded weapons to law enforcement officers engaged in controlling disorders is never justified except in the case of armed resistance that trained sniper teams are unable to handle. This was not the case at Kent State, yet each guardsman carried a loaded M1 rifle. This lesson is not new. The National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders and the guidelines of the Department of the Army set it out explicitly. No one would have died at Kent State if this lesson had been learned by the Ohio National Guard. Even if the guardsmen faced danger, it was not a danger that called for lethal force. The 61 shots by 28 guardsmen certainly cannot be justified. Apparently, no order to fire was given. As the Scranton Commission were investigating Kent State, so were the authorities. These young victims of the Kent State Massacre were only 19 and 20 years old. This had been a tragedy, and they risked being forgotten. The Scranton Commission seemed to be successful in its aim to draw a line under Kent State. But by 1973, the case was being reopened. On the 18th of June 1973, an Ohio newspaper, the New York Advocate, published an article entitled "Caution Urged on Kent." It read, "A top-level Justice Department official has cautioned against false expectations that his reopening of files on the May 1970 Kent State student shootings will lead to a federal grand jury probe. But Assistant Attorney General John Stanley Pottinger, who heads the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, confirmed that since April he has been reviewing the shootings of 4 Kent State students. He said he will conclude his review within a month. All I can tell you now is that I want to do a responsible job of the review, and that takes some time," the former Dayton resident said during his first news conference since he took over his job in February. Despite his lengthy open statement, in which the Kent State inquiry was not mentioned, the majority of questions focused on speculation that he and Attorney General Elliot L. Richardson will reverse former Attorney John Mitchell's 1971 decision against convening a federal grand jury. Pottinger said his review of the case, revealed in a June 1st letter from Richardson to Kent State President Glenn Olds, does not signal a determination that it was wrongly closed initially. It does not mean that expectations on the part of anybody of either side of that issue should be raised or changed, he said. Again, it was going to be John Stanley Pottinger who cleaned up another controversial issue.
I was hit in the left heel, and it just took the right side of my left foot off.
Now a history professor, Grace wrote Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long 60s, which looked at what happened and why. He and others maintained that an audio recording, reanalyzed in 2007, contains evidence of an order to fire. 8 guardsmen were indicted in 1973 for their involvement, but the case was thrown out the following year. Grace is among a group that believes the federal investigation into the shootings should be reopened, even 50 years later.
So it helps us to understand better what took place there, and that there was some degree of foresight on the part of the National Guard in terms of what they did. The National Guard always maintained that they fired in defense of their lives.
Well, going back to 1970, at the time the National Guard fired 67 gunshots into our crowd of unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9, including me. There was always a big mystery. Why did they shoot? The commanding officers on the scene all denied giving a verbal order to fire, and they claimed that the individual guardsmen, out of a total of 76 guardsmen on the hilltop, about 28 of them fired their guns, about a dozen fired into the crowd. But the big mystery always was there an order to fire or not? So many of us have been trying to do the research down through the years, and just recently I had the very good luck to find literally a needle in a haystack. I found a key bit of evidence that's been overlooked for 37 years. It turned out to be located inside of a tape recording made by a student on May 4th, 1970. A student named Terry Struby had the foresight to put a reel-to-reel tape recorder by his window of his dormitory, and he put the microphone on the windowsill, and he went outside, and he thought he would record the sounds of a rally. Well, it turned out the guardsmen fired tear gas. They chased us over a hill, and after about 24 minutes of a confrontation, when they finally marched back up a hilltop, it looked like they were retreating, but suddenly, out of 76 guardsmen, about a dozen guardsmen altogether on the right flank stopped, turned, raised their weapons, and they began to shoot, mostly M1 rifles, which are very deadly, powerful weapons, right into the crowd. I was a witness. I was down near the bottom of the hill about 225 feet away. I got shot through my wrist. But more importantly, I think I was an eyewitness. I saw those guys stop, turn, raise their weapons, and all begin to shoot, and then continue to shoot 67 shots during 13 seconds. I assumed immediately there was an order to fire, but then we went through all these court cases, and the officers denied giving the order. Well, finally, I found the proof.
Well, why didn't anyone find this before?
We did get a version of that tape. The 13 seconds of gunfire was presented in our court cases in the 1970s, but they only digitized at that time. I'm talking about the U.S. Justice Department. And of course, we know that back in 1970, the Justice Department was dominated by J. Edgar Hoover, who was basically a criminal. So we're not surprised to think that back then J. Edgar Hoover may have suppressed this information, but more likely what our attorneys are saying is at the time of our trial in 1975, they only had an analog tape, which was one of those little cassettes. And that's what's been sitting in the Yale Library all these decades. And when I contacted Yale and I noticed online they had a copy of the Struby tape, I called the Yale archivist. I said, is it possible to get a copy and a CD? She says, yes, we can make you one for $10. So as soon as I got my hands on that CD, I put it in my computer, which had very modest speakers, not exactly top-notch speakers or anything. And I got to the point, it's about a 29-minute tape, but when I got to near the end of the tape, I knew the shooting sequence would be coming. I knew that would be a difficult moment to hear that. But I was just stunned when I heard the verbal command to fire immediately before the shootings. What I heard was this: right here, get set, point, fire, and then the 13 seconds of gunfire.
Wow. And that just totally goes against the official story, is that right?
Well, it certainly blows away the cover-up. The National Guard leadership at the time on the hilltop there, at the moment of the shootings, there was a general, there was a lieutenant colonel, and there was a major. And we have their courtroom testimony under oath. We have their sworn depositions. We have their federal grand jury testimony. We have numerous examples of them swearing oaths and to tell the truth, and they all deny giving the order. But clearly it's a militaristic command, shouted in a very militaristic way, and it's not like it's something that was whispered or just stated. It was a shouted military command.
A Miami News article on Friday, November the 8th, 1974, announced that 8 Kent State Guardsmen were acquitted by a U.S. judge. The article states, in Washington, J. Stanley Pottinger, Assistant Attorney General of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, said, "We felt that the case should have been decided by a jury instead of the judge. With that ruling, we are disappointed. But we are not disappointed with our efforts to see that justice was done. The department has done everything in its power to air the causes of this tragedy and to enforce the law. The court's ruling today ends the federal government's prosecution in the Kent State case. This is subject only to a remote possibility of an appeal which, in any event, appears to be precluded as a matter of law." In May 2007, the Tampa Bay Times reported on Alan Canfora's finding of the audio recording of the order to fire. It states, the reel-to-reel audio recording was made by a student who placed a microphone at a windowsill of his dormitory, Canfora said. Stan Pottinger, who helped prosecute the guardsman when he was Assistant Attorney General with the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, said Tuesday he doubts anything was overlooked then. He said that he could not specifically recall the tape, but that audio recordings and films were carefully studied. Canfora said only a small portion of tape was reviewed during various investigations. Regardless of what we know now, the Kent State grand jury proceedings were considered successful at the time, and Stanley Pottinger was seen as being at the center of that success. Even though J. Stanley Pottinger kept putting his hand in the fire, he never seemed to get burnt.
Shaping a great reset for the post-Corona era.